Number 10. Shay Groves. Most of us will never understand why some people idolize serial killers, but it's a real phenomenon, and some of these superfans go as far as trying to commit horrific crimes that match or even outdo the actions of their role models. 27-year-old Shay Groves decorated her home in the English town of Havant with framed photos of Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Peter Sutcliffe, and other notorious serial killers who went down in history for their gruesome crimes. She also had a collection of books about these disgraced members of society and a collection of weapons including knives, Viking axes, and a Celtic dagger that she kept beneath her pillow. Some might wonder if Groves was waiting for an opportunity to act out a sadistic fantasy on someone, and unfortunately that part may never be known. But she took drastic measures one day in 2022 when she thought her boyfriend, a 25-year-old father of two named Frankie Fitzgerald, was talking to another woman. Fitzgerald had actually blocked the woman and wasn't communicating with her at the time, but Groves was apparently too blinded by jealousy to realize this. Then, taking a page out of her hero's handbook, she murdered Fitzgerald in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. Using her prized Celtic dagger, Groves cut her boyfriend's throat and then plunged a blade into his chest a total of 17 times. According to investigators, she relied on true crime documentaries in her attempt to create a false narrative and stage an alibi, but her armchair expertise was no match for the seasoned detectives who identified her as the culprit responsible for Fitzgerald's murder. Prosecutors accused Groves of launching the deadly attack while her boyfriend was asleep in her bed, and as a result she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 23 years. During her sentencing hearing, the judge described the relationship between Groves and Fitzgerald as having a dangerous dynamic, fueled by alcohol and cocaine. He concluded that Groves acted on impulse when she lost her temper over her cheating suspicions, resulting in a needless tragedy that took one young person's life and destroyed another's future. Number 9. Young Yu Young. In June of 2023, a 23-year-old Korean woman and self-proclaimed true crime enthusiast named Young Yu Young decided to satisfy her nagging curiosity about what it feels like to kill someone. So she contacted a college student who was working on the side as a tutor and requested English lessons. And the unsuspecting target was happy to book a lesson at her apartment in the port city of Busan. To make herself seem like a real student, Young bought a fake school uniform and wore it to the woman's home, where she stabbed and dismembered the victim. She changed into the victim's clothing after getting blood on her fake school uniform, then loaded some of the victim's body parts into a suitcase and took a taxi cab to a wooded area where she allegedly dumped the luggage. In her rookie attempt to pull off the perfect crime, she held onto several of the victim's personal effects, including the woman's wallet and cell phone, to prevent anyone who discovered her body from being able to identify her. But Young quickly learned that she wasn't cut out for getting away with murder. The taxi driver who drove her to the suitcase dump site was quick to notice that the young woman was acting suspiciously, and he called the police to report her strange behavior. Young then turned herself in at the urging of her family, who implored her to do the right thing and admit to her actions. During a search of Young's property, police found several garbage bags filled with more of the victim's dismembered body parts. But they were even more disturbed by how eerily calm the suspect was after killing someone in cold blood. A police spokesperson told local news outlet the Chosun Ilbo that Young's obsession with killing began with her interest in books and TV shows about murder. He further stated that Young was remorseful for her crime and that she was undergoing tests to determine whether she was a psychopath. Number 8. Cody Akland. 18-year-old Bobby Ann McLeod was waiting for a bus in Plymouth, England to go see her boyfriend in November 2021 when a man she'd never met snuck up behind her and struck her in the head with a hammer, knocking her out cold. The attacker, 24-year-old Cody Akland, forced the much smaller woman into his car and drove 19 miles to a parking lot where he bludgeoned McLeod to death with the hammer. He then threw the victim's body in the trunk of his car and drove to a wooded area where he tossed her naked remains down an embankment. The next day, Akland threw the hammer into a river in a neighboring town and hid the victim's clothing, hoping to get away with his crime. He then went and socialized with his friends like it was any other day. Akland had no criminal record prior to McLeod's murder, but he'd spent plenty of time obsessing over and researching the attack methods of American serial killer Ted Bundy. Investigators theorized that he was trying to mimic Bundy's modus operandi, which consisted of approaching the victim in public, knocking the victim unconscious, and killing them elsewhere. But Akland did one major thing differently from Ted Bundy. 2 days after McLeod's murder, he entered a police station and confessed to the crime. And in addition to identifying the location of the body on a map, he gave a detailed account of his actions. He also described how McLeod survived for around an hour and a half after the attack began, making for a slow and painful death. During the interview, Akland admitted that McLeod reminded him of women he dated in the past, but he insisted that this wasn't a motive in the attack. Investigators found 3,000 pictures in his phone relating to his serial killer obsession. The images included murder scenes, dismembered bodies, weapons, and autopsy photos. Experts determined that Akland suffered from a handful of emotional challenges stemming from his childhood, but he was deemed mentally competent to be held fully responsible for his actions. He denied attacking McLeod with the intention of killing her, but prosecutors argued otherwise. In the end, Akland was found guilty of murder and received a life sentence behind bars with a minimum of 30 years. Number 7. Taylor Shabis. In one of the most gruesome murder cases to make U.S. news headlines in recent years, a 24-year-old Wisconsin woman killed and dismembered her romantic partner during a meth-fueled booty call in early 2022. Taylor Shabis was the last person to see 25-year-old Shad Thyrian alive in the hours before his mother found his body parts strewn throughout the basement of her home in Green Bay. Police tracked Shabis down shortly after the horrifying discovery and were quick to notice that the suspect appeared to be mentally unstable. Shabis admitted to using methamphetamine with Thyrian shortly before the victim's death. She said that she snapped and blacked out and that she couldn't remember what had happened during the violent encounter. But her lapse in memory only made her seem more suspicious to the authorities, as more of Thyrian's dismembered body parts were found in her van. Despite initially claiming that she couldn't remember the crime, Shabis made several disturbing statements indicating that she was more aware of her actions than she perhaps wanted to admit. She said that she began choking Thyrian in an erotic fashion during their tryst, and that she enjoyed doing it so much that she didn't stop. Shabis said that she felt excited by seeing Thyrian's corpse and told investigators that his head was the first body part she severed. Authorities charged Shabis with first-degree intentional homicide, assault, and mutilating a corpse. And given her behavior during questioning and the particularly brutal nature of the crime, the court paid particularly close attention to her mental health. Shortly after the arrest, journalist Ann Schwartz accused Shabis of being obsessed with serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Schwartz broke the story of Dahmer back in 1991, and she's written 2 books on the prolific case. More than 30 years later, she claimed that sources with insider knowledge of Thyrian's murder had told her Shabis was fixated on Dahmer's crimes. In a disturbing parallel between the cases, Shabis was accused of abusing Thyrian's corpse in similar ways to how Dahmer mutilated his victims. She continued to display erratic and unstable behavior throughout her court proceedings. During a competency hearing in early 2023, she attacked her public defender, Quinn Jolly, in an unprovoked fit of rage. A court deputy wrestled Shabis to the floor, and she was removed from the courtroom. During the summer of 2023, the jury found Shabis guilty as charged. The disruptive defendant was wearing a spit hood at her sentencing hearing in September, when she learned that she'd be spending the rest of her life behind bars. Number 6. Christopher Wilson. In February 2010, Mackenzie Cowell left her cosmetology school in Wenatchee, Washington, for what was supposed to be a quick errand. She was seen driving away in her car, but failed to return to her class 15 minutes later as planned. Mackenzie's family began to worry that evening after her father tried to call her and was unable to get through. So they alerted the authorities, and a search was launched. The teen's car was found abandoned 5 miles from her beauty school, and 4 days after Mackenzie vanished, her strangled, stabbed, and bludgeoned body was found roughly 20 miles outside Wenatchee, near the Columbia River. Her killer had tried to saw off one of her arms, but had apparently given up after realizing that severing a human limb is a lot harder than it looks in the movies. Investigators interviewed more than 800 people over the following 7 months as they worked tirelessly to identify Mackenzie's killer. Evidence and eyewitness accounts eventually linked a young man named Christopher Wilson to the crime, and Mackenzie's DNA was found inside his apartment. According to court records, several people had contacted police with their concerns about Wilson shortly after Mackenzie went missing. One tipster wrote a letter to law enforcement accusing the suspect of being obsessed with gore and serial killers, while another claimed that he enjoyed cutting up bodies while working for local funeral homes. Wilson also had a tattoo of the fictional character Hannibal Lecter, which is creepy to say the least. The judge banned prosecutors from mentioning any of these details in the courtroom, but they were able to make a strong enough case to make the suspect realize that it was in his best interest to take a deal. After initially turning down a plea offer that would have come with a 10-year prison sentence, Wilson pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to a little over 14 years in prison. The 43-year-old remains behind bars for now, but could see freedom any time now. Number 5. Brent Christensen. After earning her master's degree, Yingying Zhang moved from China to the United States to pursue a PhD at the University of Illinois in Urbana, but she vanished in June of 2017, just 2 months after her arrival. As police worked to trace Yingying's last known movements, they discovered that she'd missed a bus and ran late for a scheduled apartment viewing. Surveillance footage showed a dark Saturn Astra pulling up to the woman right after she missed her ride. Yingying got in the car and was never seen again. The security footage was too grainy for investigators to obtain the car's license plate number, but the Saturn Astra is not a popular car. At the time, there were just 18 of them registered in Champaign County, and the car in the video had visible damage, which enabled detectives to identify its owner as a married PhD student named Brent Christensen. At first glance, Christensen seemed like an unlikely suspect. He led a quiet and seemingly respectable lifestyle as a dedicated physics scholar who spent much of his spare time at home playing video games. In fact, that's what he claimed he was doing when Yingying vanished. There was no way to confirm Christensen's alibi because his wife was out of town at the time, but he remained calm and collected, as if he felt confident that he'd soon be eliminated as a person of interest. He nevertheless remained on law enforcement's radar as they continued working on the case. Meanwhile, a massive search for Yingying turned up empty. Yingying's family traveled to the US to participate in the effort, which was carried out by both law enforcement and a large number of volunteers from the academic community. The FBI offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to Yingying's whereabouts, but no tipsters came forward. A search of Christensen's car revealed that the passenger side door had been meticulously cleaned compared to the rest of the vehicle, and under mounting pressure from investigators, the suspect finally admitted that he was the person who picked Yingying up on the day she disappeared. He didn't identify her by name, but said that he'd given a ride to a young Asian woman who began to panic and fled from the vehicle just a few blocks from where he'd picked her up. Still lacking enough evidence to charge Christensen in the case, authorities placed him under surveillance in hopes of landing their smoking gun. After learning that he was in an open marriage and had a casual girlfriend, investigators persuaded the woman to wear a wire and record their conversations. At the time, Christensen's girlfriend thought he was innocent. She agreed to wear the wire because she thought it would help clear his name. But that all changed during a memorial walk in Yingying's honor several weeks after she went missing, when the girlfriend asked Christensen to tell her the truth about his suspected involvement in the case. To her surprise, Christensen admitted to abducting Yingying, holding her at his apartment against her will, and killing her. He claimed he was a serial killer and that Yingying was his 13th victim. Authorities never found any evidence of additional victims, but they remained convinced that Christensen had murdered Yingying. They charged him with federal counts of kidnapping and lying to the FBI, which he pleaded not guilty to. Ying Ying's body was never found, but based on the evidence, prosecutors accused Christensen of beating the young woman with a baseball bat and decapitating her. They claimed that he spent months planning to abduct and kill someone, and that he idolized serial killers. At the beginning of Christensen's trial in 2019, his defense attorney admitted to the court that the defendant had killed Ying Ying, but he maintained his not guilty plea, and the proceedings continued. Then, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury came back with a guilty verdict, and as a result, Christensen was sentenced to life in prison without parole. After the trial ended, he revealed that he discarded the victim's body in a dumpster. But unfortunately for her family, this meant that her remains ended up in a landfill, and by then, so much time had passed that recovering them would be impossible. Number 4. Kyle Rutters. 32-year-old Lynette Volshank was minding her business at home in South Africa's Western Cape province in May of 2019 when her neighbor barged in and stabbed her to death in a frenzied knife attack. The killer, 28-year-old Kyle Rutters, was hooked on drugs and owed his dealer 30,000 rand, which is equivalent to about $1,635 US. He murdered Volshank as part of a twisted plan to rob someone of their valuables and pay off the drug debt. After choosing Volshank as his victim, Rutters waited outside her apartment building and followed her into her flat. Volshank had little time to react before her attacker grabbed a knife off the kitchen counter and began plunging it into her flesh. And sadly, she died fighting for her life. Once she stopped moving, Rutters began cutting her body up with an electric handsaw. He discarded some body parts around the city of Belleville and stashed others inside his own flat where he lived with his aunt. He left the rest of the victim's remains in garbage bags at the murder scene. Volshank's colleagues raised the alarm after stopping at her residence to check on her when she failed to show up for work and discovering the horror inside. Her severed head was found in a plastic bag that had been thrown into some bushes near the apartment building. And in addition to recovering some of Volshank's body parts inside the suspect's flat, police found several of her belongings, including a cupcake pan, keys, clothing, and medication. Investigators also discovered some partially printed counterfeit currency, which perhaps speaks to the suspect's financial desperation. Given the particularly gruesome nature of the crime, authorities suspected that Rutters' issues ran deeper than addiction and put him under psychiatric observation. Experts observed definite psychopathic traits, including little consideration for others and hatred toward women in general over past romantic rejections. He was also known among his co-workers as a really nice guy, which suggests that he also used psychopathic charm to conceal his dark side. During the assessment, Rutters allegedly admitted to stalking a previous victim who refused to give him her phone number. He was also obsessed with serial killers, according to a psychiatric report from 2022, which listed Ted Bundy and the Zodiac Killer as two of Rutters' personal favorites. The report also revealed that Rutters tracked the movements of several potential victims and researched how to dismember a human body before the murder. This revelation contradicted the defense's argument that the defendant didn't decide to dismember Volshank's body until after he killed her. Investigators uncovered a series of disturbing notes in Rutters' phone, including one stating, "I am the smartest serial killer the world has ever seen." According to an update in the case from November 2023, prosecutors were fighting to have Rutters declared a dangerous criminal, which would land him behind bars indefinitely. Number 3. Chance Senica. When a Louisiana resident named Chance Senica lured a gay man to his kidnapping in 2020, it was supposed to be the first in a series of crimes meant to emulate his favorite serial killers. Senica made plans to meet with 18-year-old Holden White under the guise of a potential romantic interest after connecting on the Grindr app. But instead of taking White on a traditional date, Senica picked him up and drove him to an isolated property in rural Lafayette Parish, where he handcuffed the victim. He then proceeded to beat, strangle, and stab White until he thought the young man was dead. After attempting to dismember the victim, Senica dialed 911, told the dispatcher he'd killed someone, and requested to be taken to a mental institution. Emergency responders found White clinging to life and rushed him to the hospital, where he spent several days in a coma before miraculously pulling through and surviving his injuries. In the meantime, investigators discovered that Senica had spent months plotting the attack. According to prosecutors, he'd met up with a different target the night before he nearly killed White, but got nervous and backed out of his plan to attack the first intended victim. Senica allegedly wanted to mimic the crimes of cannibal serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who murdered and dismembered at least 17 men between 1978 and 1991. During his 13-year killing spree, Dahmer lured unsuspecting men to his Milwaukee apartment under the promise of intimacy. He photographed and dismembered his victims' bodies and stored the remains in his apartment for future consumption. According to authorities, Senica planned to preserve and eat his victims' bodies in a similar fashion. Thankfully, though, he never got that far. But White still suffers from long-term physical and mental effects of the attack, including the loss of feeling in one of his hands. In September 2022, Senica pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and received a 45-year federal prison sentence. Number 2. Brandon MichaelFlurry. On Valentine's Day in 2018, a deranged gunman named Nicholas Cruz opened fire on students and staff at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, killing 17 people. 9 months later, a California man with no connection to the mass shooting began harassing survivors of the massacre and relatives of the victims who lost their lives. Over a 3-week period starting in December 2018, Brandon MichaelFlurry taunted and threatened his targets from his home in Santa Ana. He sent hundreds of messages from over a dozen Instagram accounts, including several impersonating the Parkland shooter. His social media handles included the Douglas Shooter, Nicholas Killed Your Sister, and Nicholas the Murderer. The messages Flurry sent to the victims were chilling and heartless, consisting of statements like, "I killed your loved ones, ha ha ha," and "With the power of my AR-15, I take your loved ones away from you permanently." Victims later reported feeling terrified by the trolling, and Flurry's timing during the first holiday season after the shooting added an extra layer of cruelty to his actions. In addition to impersonating Cruz, Flurry trolled the victims under the alias Ted Bundy, further pointing toward a disturbing fascination with depraved killers. The defense argued that Flurry had no idea that his trolling was illegal and that he was just doing what many other people do online. His attorney also pointed toward his diagnosis on the autism spectrum as a mitigating factor in his crimes. Jeff Caskey, whose son was murdered in the Parkland massacre, was among many who took a less forgiving stance. In a victim impact statement, he described the defense's attempt to blame Flurry's actions on autism as cowardice. Max Schachter, the father of another slain student, expressed a fear that Flurry would try to follow in the footsteps of the serial killers and mass murderers that he seemed to idolize. A federal jury found the defendant guilty of 3 counts of cyberstalking and 1 count of making a kidnapping threat. The prosecution urged the judge to impose the maximum sentence of 20 years, while the defense asked for Flurry to be placed in a residential treatment facility. He was sentenced to just over 5 years in a low-security federal prison with a program specializing in skill building for disabled inmates. The judge also ordered Flurry to undergo observation by mental health experts to determine the best approach to his rehabilitation. So one can only hope that he leaves prison as a changed man. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. Michael Madison. While responding to calls about a foul stench surrounding a handful of properties in East Cleveland, Ohio in 2013, police discovered the decomposing bodies of 3 missing women stuffed into garbage bags. Sherelda Terry, Angela Deskins, and Shatisha Sheely had been assaulted, tortured, mutilated, and strangled to death. One of the bodies was discovered in a garage leased by 35-year-old Michael Madison, a convicted criminal with a violent history. The other 2 bodies were found in a field and an abandoned home near the garage. Madison coldly and remorselessly confessed to the murders. He was charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder and various other crimes that came to light throughout the investigation. Authorities speculated that Madison was inspired by serial killer Anthony Sowell, who was sentenced to death in 2011 for killing 11 women in Cleveland, just a handful of years before Madison's arrest. The remains of Sowell's victims were discovered throughout his house and yard in 2009, after a woman he intended to kill escaped and went to the police. Most of the victims appeared to have been gagged or strangled to death after being lured to Sowell's home with promises of drugs. Sowell passed away on death row from a terminal illness in 2021. During Madison's trial, the defendant taunted and smiled at his victim's surviving family members, prompting the father of one of the slain women to attack him in the courtroom. Footage of the encounter went viral on social media, with many commenters stating that they felt the assault was deserved. Madison was found guilty on 13 counts, including all 3 murders, and was sentenced to death. He remains on death row after unsuccessfully challenging his conviction, but no execution date has been set. In recent years, critics of the true crime genre have accused filmmakers and fans alike of glamorizing and glorifying cold-blooded killers and disrespecting victims' families by bringing unwanted publicity to cases that loved ones are trying to grieve and move on from. On the other hand, supporters of the genre have argued that the public has a right to know about criminal cases and that filmmakers shouldn't have to obtain the blessing from a victim's family to move forward with their coverage of a case.
8. Joan Maxwell. When 53-year-old Scottish attorney Diarmaid Bruce denied former client Joan Maxwell access to legal paperwork she requested in 2021, she embarked on a relentless stalking and harassment campaign against him and his employees at the firm's office in Lanarkshire. The disgruntled 34-year-old scratched the lawyer's $150,000 Mercedes-Benz on 2 separate occasions, during one of which she carved a slur into the hood of the car. She caused over $1,200 worth of damage to the vehicle. Maxwell also pelted one of Bruce's colleagues and the man's car with eggs, poured an unknown liquid on a female employee, and shouted obscenities at staff members over a period spanning from January 2021 to March 2022. The law firm eventually got the police involved and she was arrested. Judge Ross McFarlane narrowly spared Maxwell from prison time and instead banned her from contacting the victims or going anywhere near the law office for 10 years. She was also ordered to perform 200 hours of community service. McFarlane told the press that if Maxwell even slightly violates the conditions set forth by the court, she could end up in serious trouble with the law. 7. Amilio Maldonado. A few days before Christmas in 2010, a man named Amilio Maldonado contacted San Antonio real estate agent Janice Tisdale and asked her to show him an upscale property in a remote subdivision that he was interested in. He said that his banker would also be present at the viewing, but when Tisdale arrived at the address, Maldonado was the only person there. Maldonado said his banker couldn't make it, and something made Tisdale feel uneasy, even though she'd met with the client on several prior occasions with no issues. Trusting her gut, the 68-year-old removed her jewelry before exiting her car. She also opened several of the home's doors before going inside, so she would have an escape exit if something bad were to happen. Tisdale's unexplainable feeling of terror only heightened as she gave Maldonado a tour of the house. Her instincts were telling her to run, but the rational part of her mind was fighting the urge. When she couldn't ignore the strange feeling any longer, Tisdale said it was time to go. She went to pick something up off the floor and was hit over the head. Tisdale fell forward and hit her forehead against a stone wall. Her client had hit her with the tool used by truck drivers called a tire thumper, which he'd been carrying inside his boot. Instead of reacting with fear, Tisdale demanded to know why Maldonado hit her. He told her he needed $4,000 and held her hostage for nearly an hour. Luckily, Tisdale had previously worked as a flight attendant and was trained on how to act in this type of situation. She eventually convinced Maldonado to grab a piece of paper from his truck and fled the scene on foot. Maldonado ran after her, but she managed to flag down some teens who were driving around. They quickly came to her aid and got her to safety. Speaking with 2020 from prison, where he's serving a 60-year sentence for aggravated robbery, Maldonado said he had drugs in his system when he committed the crime. 6. Dale Holloway. Public defender Michael Davidow was talking with an incarcerated client, 37-year-old Dale Holloway, at a New Hampshire jail in 2019, when a guard overheard the customary knock indicating that the meeting was over. But when he looked into the room, he saw blood dripping from Davidow's face as the lawyer cupped his hands over an injury. Davidow was hospitalized in the intensive care unit and spent months recovering. He later told the Associated Press that his client was upset because his firm was representing the defendant accused of killing the inmate's stepfather. Holloway brutally attacked Davidow, causing the victim to fear for his life. No guards overheard the assault as Holloway repeatedly struck his lawyer in the face and head, leaving him with a broken nose, a brain bleed, memory loss, and other injuries. Authorities charged Holloway with attempted murder. In court, the prosecutor pointed out the defendant's history of violence and argued for the maximum sentence, while Holloway's attorney argued that her client was traumatized from a difficult upbringing and saw Davidow as a threat to him and his family when the attack occurred. Holloway pleaded guilty to a reduced assault charge and received a 7.5 to 15-year prison sentence. He's also facing an attempted murder charge for an unrelated shooting that happened prior to the attack on Davidow. The trial is currently delayed due to concerns regarding his mental health. 5. Svi Oswang. During a routine visit at the home of a young man named Svi Oswang in Boca Raton, Florida in 2022, a mental health therapist noticed that her client kept coming in and out of the room and that none of the other household members seemed to be home. Oswang got a little too close for comfort, so she decided to leave. When she got to the front door, she noticed a black material covering the window, which hadn't been there when she entered the home. Oswang allegedly grabbed the woman from behind in a bear hug and bound her hands behind her back. He put her phone on airplane mode and held her captive overnight, during which time he repeatedly hit her and did other horrific and unthinkable things. The therapist pleaded with the suspect to free her, but he refused to let her go. At times, she worried that her client was going to kill her, but she used her mental health training to defuse the situation as much as possible. Police tracked down the victim's whereabouts the next day after finding out that nobody had heard from her since before Oswang's appointment. Nobody answered the door, but when officers knocked on a window, they heard a scream from inside, so they forced their way in. They found the victim being held at knife point inside a bedroom closet. When the suspect refused to drop the knife, an officer shot him in the head. He survived his injuries and faces 6 felonies, including attempted first-degree murder with a weapon, kidnapping, and 4 counts of battery. 4. Dustin Holden. Real estate agent Lenora Farrington was hosting an open house near Smith Mountain Lake, Virginia in 2020, when a man later identified as Dustin Holden walked in and acted interested in the property. He put his information down on the sign-in sheet and they engaged in some friendly chatter about his job and children. Holden left at some point and returned when the house was empty. For reasons that were never explained, he struck Farrington in the head repeatedly with a crescent wrench while she fought for her life. Using her second-degree black belt skills, Farrington fought for her life. She managed to kick the wrench out of Holden's hand, and he allegedly asked her for money and explicit favors. The suspect cleaned out Farrington's purse and fled the scene, at which point she locked the door and dialed 911, grateful to be alive. She was hospitalized for her injuries, but was thankfully expected to recover. Officers located Holden several hours after the assault and took him into custody without incident. According to the Bedford County Sheriff's Office, there was no evidence to indicate any prior connection between the suspect and the victim, and the attack appeared to be random. Records showed that Holden was on parole for previous felony convictions at the time of the attack, including petty larceny, obtaining money by false pretenses, shoplifting, and DUI. During a court hearing regarding the attack on Farrington, a doctor testified that the victim's injuries are not normally survivable. 3. Lester Ralph Jones. 34-year-old single mother of 3 Paige Bergfeld left her children with their nanny at her home in Colorado one day in 2007 and never returned. During the investigation into her disappearance, detectives discovered that she was living a double life and moonlighting as an escort to make ends meet, something her loved ones were totally unaware about until that point. After failing to find incriminating evidence against either of Bergfeld's ex-husbands, investigators put the men on the back burner as potential suspects. They focused on her professional life and discovered that the last known person to interact with Bergfeld was a man named Lester Jones, who'd contacted her to inquire about her services. Police believe Jones might have been the last person to see Bergfeld alive, and their suspicions grew when her car was found on fire 3 days after she vanished, and canines identified his scent at the scene. Jones denied having any contact with Bergfeld, even after officers discovered a track phone that had been in contact with her number during a search. Authorities became increasingly convinced that Jones killed Bergfeld, but without a body or more concrete evidence linking him to the case, charging him wasn't an option. A hiker discovered Paige's skeletal remains in 2012, 5 years after she went missing. It was too late to determine how she was killed, but it appeared as though someone had bound her, and it was clear that she had met a violent end. Jones was charged with murder, but continued to maintain his innocence. In court, his attorney pointed the finger at Bergfeld's other clients, who they claimed could have been the killer, and reminded the jury that the evidence was purely circumstantial. The first trial ended in a hung jury, even after Jones's ex-wife testified to his violent tendencies and recalled being kidnapped by him years earlier. Finally, in 2016, 9 years after Bergfeld's disappearance, Jones was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, second-degree murder, felony murder, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. 2. Neil Rice. When a successful young marketing professional named Neil Rice found himself feeling lonely and wishing he could be with the woman who didn't return his feelings, he entered a psychic shop in Manhattan, looking for answers to his emptiness and sadness. He paid the psychic, named Brandy, $2,500 for a reading. After deciding that Brandy wasn't the right spiritual provider for his needs, Rice began going to 26-year-old Priscilla Kelly Del Maro in Times Square. The meeting happened in 2013 and was the first of many that would happen over the next 20 months. Rice had no history of going to psychics or falling for scams, but now he was doing both, and the costs of getting the universe to turn in his favor quickly stacked up. When things in his life failed to take a positive turn as predicted by Del Maro, she blamed bad energy and said she needed money for materials and rituals. At one point, she told Rice she needed money for a time machine, but accepted a $30,000 Rolex instead. Rice grew to believe that if he didn't fork over cash when Del Maro requested it, bad things would happen to him. Even after the woman he desperately wanted to be with passed away, Del Maro convinced him that bad spirits killed her and offered to reincarnate the woman, for a price, of course. By then, Rice had dropped nearly $400,000 on her services, including $90,000 to build a golden bridge to another dimension, where Del Maro would use her gifts to ward off yet another evil spirit. Between what he spent on the first psychic, Brandy, and Del Maro, Rice was ultimately swindled out of more than $700,000, leaving him penniless, at which point he finally snapped out of his funk and realized the sheer lunacy of the situation. Many people know that psychics run a business that largely profits from people's need for hope, answers, reassurance, and other things that the future can't truly promise us, and plenty of psychics readily admit this off the record. Unfortunately, when Rice most likely needed mental health treatment, he turned to a fortune teller. Delma was arrested for defrauding Rice and pleaded guilty to 1 count of grand larceny. She served 8 months in jail, followed by 4 years of probation. In addition to feeling like her sentence was a mere slap on the wrist, Rice was told that he'll probably never get any of his money back. 1. Taylor Shabis. In early 2022, 24-year-old Taylor Shabis allegedly murdered, decapitated, and dismembered a lover named Chad Tharion. The 25-year-old victim's mother found some of his remains strewn across the basement of the family's Green Bay, Wisconsin home. After learning that Shabis was the last person seen with Tharion, police tracked her down and immediately noticed blood on her clothing. They found more of Tharion's body parts in her van. When officers asked Shabis about what happened, she replied, "That is a good question," and showed other signs of being mentally unsound. According to court documents, Shabis admitted to using methamphetamine with the victim before the crime. She told investigators that she snapped and blacked out and didn't remember the violent episode. Not surprisingly, the young woman's mental competency has landed at the center of court hearings regarding the murder charge and other crimes she faces in connection with the gruesome slaying. During a competency hearing in early 2023, Shabis' lawyer, Quinn Jolly, asked the judge to reschedule the session because an expert witness he planned to have testify was unable to make it to court that day. Something about the request apparently set Shabis off. She charged at Jolly and elbowed him in the head and had to be subdued by court officers. The judge found Shabis competent to stand trial and granted Jolly's request to withdraw from the case.
What's your opinion? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.